What's up, everyone? Welcome back, and happy Thanksgiving to all the people out there. Hopefully you had a great time spending that with your families. And today we're going to dive into the top baits of the month of December. You guys know I fish a lot in the winter. This is sort of my month to have fun and just go fishing, completely different than like maybe I would for tournament season. Like, it's sort of my fun month. You know, I've been to Italy, been to Australia, been all over the place. I'm not saying that has not been fun, because it has been a blast, but a little bit more fun to go home, and a little bit different type of fun to go home and just fish, just for, like, you know, for fun, and just running around some local lakes and sort of figuring out what's going on. I do live in the Southeast, and ultimately, you know, I travel three hours a lot of times, 2-3 hours to go to fisheries, whether it's going for smallmouth fishing, or if I'm going largemouth or spotted bass fishing. I have a lot of great fisheries right here within 3 hours of Chattanooga, so it gives me options. But December is definitely a month that this year, since we had so much rain in our region, for the guys, everybody who's sort of in the Southeast area, a lot of the Tennessee River is pretty stained up. Certain areas are pretty muddy. Of course, the mountain lakes are still pretty clean. And going back in the Highland Reservoir lakes are pretty clean. So some of the traditional patterns are working, and some things are working that maybe aren't as traditional. The water's not as clean in some of these areas, so you can switch it up a little bit. But so we're going to dive into several different things. I try to keep it fresh for you all. Several new baits just came out, and several new colors that you might not have heard about yet. So there's going to be some good stuff in this edition of this Top Baits of the Month. I'm always trying to bring it for you all, and December to me is really all about shad and minnow profile, or whatever bait fish that you have. And you're like, this is the month that the bass truly feed up the most, and they actually get the fattest. So we never really truly knew. Like, we always thought December was a tougher month, but as we started to realize, in most areas of the country, these fish are really feeding up. This is when they get to where they're in the position to be a pre-spawn female. You know what I'm saying? They have to eat a lot. So as your water temperatures are dropping, those fish are feeding, and they're moving towards their wintertime haunts and their wintertime areas. So a lot of times, wintertime, what's that mean? What's it look like? We're going to talk about all that stuff. So first bait of the month I'm going to pick, I'm going to talk about, I'm actually going to talk about the brand new bait that just came out. We talked about it last time, but it's actually in stores now, and it's online, and that's the MOOCH minnow. So MOOCH minnow versus freeloader. When are you going to throw a bigger profile minnow shape like this, or the MOOCH minnow? The MOOCH minnow is a completely different deal. Okay, the MOOCH minnow is really based on smaller profile thread fin eaters or smaller bait fish eaters. I'm trying to imitate that year's hatch of perch, potentially even bluegill, potentially, of course, threadfin shad, and even small gizzard shad. So it's not limited to just one type of bait. It's basically just that year's abundance of bait fish. So you sort of think like that, because that's typically, in most lakes, you're going to have the most of that size bait fish, unless the spawn didn't go well for the bait fish, right? Because they all spawn as well. So that being said, this bait right here has a really unique, it's not just another minnow profile bait. The mindset behind throwing a MOOCH minnow and what it really truly does is several different things. And I'm going to do a full video. I'm not going to go crazy in depth on this, but I am going to do full video on the channel here later in December to break down every little nuance of the MOOCH minnow and why I use it. So that way you guys can get through all of these. So basically, long story short, there's two main actions in the MOOCH minnow. What it has is, of course, the rolling action, like when I shake my rod. It has a rolling action on like your 1/8 to 1/4 ounce heads. But when I go up to a larger size head, on most smaller profile minnow baits, you don't get that rolling action anymore. It just goes streamlined. So 3/8, 5/16, halves, 3/4, anything like that when fishing deeper, you get like almost little to no action. So having a little tab at the end is really that little high frequency kicking tab, and it has this really small kick. It still allows it to have some freedom and still roll on lighter heads, but it has action on heavier heads. So I get the best of both worlds. One thing that I also will do is I'll actually cut and customize these, I'll cut the bottom tab if I want just a little small, even more subtle tail. So like you have this little bit like, I'm going to say like maybe 11 to 1 kicking action, which is still really high frequency. And then you have like an 11:30 to 12:30 if you cut the bottom tab off. And then of course, if you cut both of those tabs, you're going to have just sort of a straight, more streamlined action, or have more roll. So that's really the mindset behind it. And it's caught a ton of fish for me, but it's really more so, I'm going to use this more so when I know the fish are really grouping up on a little bit smaller bait fish. They're feeding on that smaller bait fish. Here, even on Chickamauga and the Tennessee River, they like smaller bait this time of year. You'll see them even in some of the mats and stuff. They'll be blowing up on small bait. Like I'm talking like that. And so that's when, I'll probably go to an 1/8 ounce head and fish it super shallow. But if I'm in a highland reservoir and I'm going to like, a highland reservoir and I'm like, okay, I need this thing to get down there deep, I might use a 1/2 ounce jig head, get it down there. I will say, as far as jig heads go, this is a VMC that's not out yet, but I will say, like, I would not go bigger than a 2/0 in a mooch minnow. 3/0's too big. Okay, so 1/0 is right here, 2/0's pretty good, 3/0. So if you're looking for a jig head to match up with your mooch minnow, make sure you sort of pick up with one that's like that 1 to 2/0 range. Now, when am I going to throw a freeloader over the mooch minnow? When I'm looking for a little bit bigger profile, when they're more traditional size, shad, perch, stuff like that. I need a little bit bigger profile. If they're on gizzard shad, that's really when I'm really worried or focusing on more of the freeloader style bait. That's when I'm going to throw it more than the mooch minnow. Bigger profile, dirtier water, bigger fish that are just really focused on a little bit bigger profile baits. That's when I'm going to pick this guy up. So a little bit different. And the one thing is because this is super TPE, this is more PVC. This guy does a great job with rigging on that VMC head, that screw lock head that I've used, the hybrid swim jig, and that's a great head for this technique. But he's a lot harder to use on this one right here. So you're not going to be able to get away. I mean, can you if you heat it up and do all these things? Yes. Do I recommend it? No. So that's the deal. And those two baits are definitely going to be killers. Come in a lot of different colors. That's the new color that I came out with, the Green Pumpkin Disco. And you saw them in, if you guys watched the last month's episode, that is the same color that I had in the freeloader. So those are sort of like that freeloader color, that Green Pumpkin Disco is insane. But other thing that I will say is just sort of real quick, just to mention, these clamshell packages definitely help a lot. So clamshell, making sure your baits are all straight, making sure you're not paying for something and not getting good action is pretty important. So that's something important with those two right there. Okay, so now we got those. Those are available. I saw them online on Academy and several other retailers. I know some bait shops are starting to get them. So they are getting in, it's definitely here now. So it's time. I will jump over here to dive into the mapping side of it real quick. I have to say, I try to review and look through the majority of the comments when I get a chance to. I don't get a comment to every single one of you, but I did see a comment that said they wanted me to break down Smith Mountain Lake. Never been there before. I will be going there next year for a BPT event, Heavy Hitters. Excited for that. I heard a lot of great things about it. I can just remember back in the day, like Skeet Reese winning a big tournament there and Kevin catching them. So it's been a while since a big tournament's been there, and now we're going to get a chance to go to Smith Mountain Lake and sort of figure it out. But wintertime fishing, I've heard it's been pretty good overall. I hear it's a pretty good fishery. So that being said, we're going to go ahead and dive into Smith Mountain Lake and look at this thing. It's pretty windy, actually. It's got like a lot of little backwaters and stuff. So, or like a lot of little like creeks and channels and stuff. So for me, with like the mooch minnow and the freeloader, I'm going to really focus on two major things here. So like what I'm going to look at is, let's just sort of go, it does say, okay, it looks like it has some timber out here too. So when you hear ditches or and more so on this Highland Reservoir lakes. All right, so as I was sort of saying, basically you have these little places and drains. Like these are ditches and drains that I would call a ditch and a drain, sort of the same thing. I mean, you have a creek channel, ditch, drain. You know, sort of similar, but Highland Reservoir is pretty highland. It has pretty steep banks. But you can sort of like the back of this creek arm right here, it sort of comes up from like 30 to like, you know, like 45, 50, 60 feet out here, and then sort of bumps up right here. A lot of times the fish will float, like push the bait in those drains, specifically in the wintertime. So that's going to be like kind of the stuff that I'm looking for if the fish are on bait. If they're not really like bait related, I'm going to more focus on like some of those little points and the secondary longer points, brush piles, of course, throwing that freeloader mooch minnow. And of course timber, because it looks like there's a lot of timber out here, so little swings. Typically my big thing in the wintertime is you want to be closer to deep water, just because, again, I think a lot of times fish move in. You don't realize how fast fish, or how often fish move in the winter. So they're very bait driven, and so if the wind blows one way or blows out or their water changes, like some of the most dramatic changes as far as fish movements happen in the winter. You would not think that's so cold, like, oh, they're going to get in a wintering, you know, spot, and they're going to sit there. They move like half mile sometimes, 3/4 of a mile or a mile, and they just are driven by completely food, you know, and that's where they're going to go, and that's where they're going to set up. So a lot of times I like that deeper water because the bait fish are typically going to be swimming in the deeper water this time of year. So I want deeper water access, and that's why I think it's so important. So that being said, that's sort of the first sort of piece of the puzzle for the month of December. Let's dive into some cold weather, cold water cranking, okay? I got some sort of special stuff I'm going to bring to you guys here this week, talking about some cold water and how to sort of, and not necessarily cold, like when I'm saying cold, it's like mid 40s to mid 50s. That's like colder water to me, you know what I'm saying? You can get you can get away with a faster retrieve in cold water right now than you can in the springtime, because they're coming from the coldest water to warming up. But I'm going to talk a little bit about like a couple of the crankbaits that I'm really sort of utilizing this time of year, and one technique and one way to sort of change them up a little bit to get a couple more bites. So right here in front of me is the new Storm Speed Trap. So Storm moved from Lure Jensen, a speed trap from Lure Jensen to Storm. So you have some of their more traditional colors of like that Phantom, like brown crawl, which is great for a cleaner water scenario. You got some more like natural colors from like the Wigglewort, and the Storm colors. So that's sort of cool. I've thrown these and swam them in the pool, and they work fine. They work great. I have a whole bunch of Lure Jensens. I was like, I'm a little bit worried, you know, when you change factories, all that stuff. But it really is a great quality bait, and they have some phenomenal crank colors. They went through them a little bit. They made some adjustments, and then you have, of course, your traditional. Where did that guy go? I just had him. Okay, so the reason why I didn't know where he was at is I caught him on the rod, and that's the most important one, and that's Crystal Crawl. Okay, so that's Crystal Crawl right there. They have like a red Crystal Crawl, like more of like a Delta Crystal Crawl. A lot of different colors. The thing with this bait, though, is he's a very high floating bait. You know, this is the actual 1/4 ounce size, and it is pretty light. He's a 1/4 ounce size. They have an 1/8 and a 1/4, and he's more of like a square bill slash like flat side, if you will. Not real aggressive, but it gets down there like 7 feet zone. The only problem that I have with this guy in the cold weather is, one, he doesn't cast super well, and two, the other problem with that is he floats fast. He's like a super high floater, right? So I have one way to trick him out to where you don't have to worry about it. And this works for a lot of your crankbaits, but you have to sort of play around with it, okay? So old school, this sort of originated from my buddy Brian Wallman and the boys, and Brian Johnson, the boys back home in Indiana. They were taking, before like good jerk baits came along, they were taking shad wraps and weighting them down. So taking, like on these higher floating baits, taking suspended strips. If you have more of a bait that you're trying to like weight it down a little bit, and you don't need that much weight, like a DT6, I'm gonna do more suspended dots, a little bit more precise, you know, if you will, where, you know, when you need a little bit more, you need to suspend strips. So what I'll do is I'll grab this guy right here, and typically I'll put 2 of these strips on him. So I'll put him sort of like center, like just over that Storm, in line with the hook. I'll grab one more and put him right there. Not perfect scenario. I'd probably line him up a little bit more, but you guys can get the gist of him. And then I'd put him in like a bathtub. Now, gotta get permission from the wife first. Bathtub, pool, sink, just to sort of get an understanding of where it is. Typically your water temperature in the wintertime is probably 60 degrees. And, you know, I would do it cold water too, because that way you get an idea, like it's, you know, going to be around that, because like things will suspend differently and sink differently in warmer water versus cold water. So that's something I played around with that too, where I was like, oh man, this does perfect. And then I get to the lake and the water's like 48. And I'm like, why is it not swimming like my bathtub? Well, because I had like 80-degree water in my bathtub. You know, so that's how it is. Sometimes you got to think like that to get even more precise. But that little technique right there, what that allows me to do, one, allows me to make further cash with this bait, because it is a 1/4 ounce. It adds some weight to that bait, and it's not going to hurt the action. Two, it allows for me to slow crank that bait down there, and your strike zones are a little bit smaller this time of year. The fish are more lethargic, and so a lot of times cranking over those rocks, I really slow down the retrieve. When I'm cranking and I'm hitting rock or hitting wood or hitting stuff, I crank that crankbait down there, and it's like, stop. It's like it's bouncing on the bottom, basically. Imagine he's bouncing on the bottom, and then it's like, stop, slow float, crank it again, and I'll go down through there, crank, stop, and it's not, you know, bringing it back up out of the strike zone, then it comes back down. You're not losing that opportunity. So what happens is you crank down through there and it stops like that, and it's like a spinning jerkbait. He's slow floating, and doop. A lot of times you'll catch them on the suspend. So I might even let it sit there for 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and then I go to crank it again. So a little bit different technique to normal cranking, but that is definitely a thing that works really well overall for a lot of different crankbaits. But again, don't overweight them, because you don't want them to sink completely. Now you can get some more depth out of them, but they're just not going to deflect off of your cover at all. If they're just completely sinking, you know, they're just going to get hung up a little bit more, and you're like, dang, Jacob, why'd you tell me to do that? So of course, get the dots, get the strips, play around with it, figure it out. Each crankbait is a little bit different, so don't necessarily say, okay, like traditionally I'm like, all right, 2 strips should be good for this, but play around with the crankbait that you're going to throw, because it's not like they're all weighted completely different. They work differently. So it might mess up the action in one, where dots do not mess up your action in the crankbait you're throwing. You know what I'm saying? So it's a little bit different in that scenario. As far as rod and reel, these are the brand new Jacob Wheeler 2.0 rods. They're just getting out here really soon here. They're just sort of popping into stores. These rods right here, I designed a little bit differently than the original series. The original series is going to be is going away, and it's sort of like eventually going to be discontinued. So if you do you know, really like the crank, like the graphite composite cranking rod, that one's going to go away. There's a couple of them that's going to go away. Make sure to stock up on the original series. They're going to be available. Some of the actions are the same or similar. I made sort of micro adjustments in some things, and then I made major adjustments in others of like that. I really wanted to adjust this rod. Not as many SKUs in the 2.0, but basically just the fish catching SKUs that I use day in and day out. The 7.2 cranking rod, I sort of have gone through the era of like Kevin Van Dam cranking with a graphite composite. I've used some of his rods. That's sort of what inspired me to do a 7.2 graphite composite in my first series. You know, basically almost won the classic on that rod. Great rod, but it is super heavy. It is super heavy. I love the action of it, but I really sort of played around with that, and I thought about it a little bit more. And I had a 7.6 medium heavy cranking rod, more for big plugs. That won't be in the series. So if you guys are looking for like those 2 rods right there, make sure you stock up on them for sure. This rod right here is more of a graphite rod, has good action to him. Not my rod I'm going to throw a DT10 on, but a rod that I'm definitely going to crank all my medium running crankbaits on, from a DT6 to like a flat side. It's sort of that perfect in between, and I played around with it like, you know, 2 years ago when I was sort of trying to sort of design them and mess around with some stuff. And I can't wait to start throwing this rod a lot. I haven't been able to throw it obviously because, but it's been something that I've been designing and working with them, the guys over there at Ducky Fishing, to design this to perfection. So really good cranking rod, catches a lot of fish, has the right backbone to it, and has that right parabolic bend. That's really the main reason why I designed that one. So that being said, 12-pound line, cranking line, day in and day out for me. But that is sort of the breakdown of these guys right here. I will also mention in my cranking side of this, you cannot go wrong with the OG Tiny. this guy is going to be a little bit shallower runner. And he doesn't suspend, but you could put a strip on him if you want to get a little more depth, or you want to slow him down like a slower like a rise, so you don't want him to float up too awful much. Also, one other thing that I have to tell you guys is new colors in for the DT6 and the DT10 and the DT series. This is a crystal crawl. So if you are a fan of the OG Speed Trap, this is their version of the crystal crawl crankbait color. So different color, more like I would call spring crawl. That's sort of like what it is, but that's a really good crankbait color. Okay, so now that we got all that sort of settled down, I will also mention, because I did say shad is the main forage this time of year, and I really only have one shad profile crankbait in this one right here. And I do have a crawdad color crankbait in there. So you're like, all right, Jake, you just told me you need to be throwing everything shad related, but it's not always that way in shallow water. Some of the fish that stay up there, they're really focused on eating crawfish, okay? So I will, in the dirtier water, start to transition this time of year. I still will start with a shad profile, because I do think that the bigger groups of fish are focused on shad and focused on bait fish. So the biggest population of your fish will be focused on bait fish, but there's a subcategory of those fish, a smaller group of fish that's focused on crawfish, and sometimes that could be the biggest fish in your lake. So you got to sort of figure that out, you know what I'm saying? So clear water, of course, like a phantom brown crawl or more of the natural crawl. I'm not a big guy on red this time of year. I don't transition to red until the water bottoms out, so it's February-ish, but I do not mind like a crystal crawl. Crystal crawl is more of like that spring crawl color, so more of like a chartreusey brown, orangish. I like that in some stained water at times. And then, of course, I just sort of wait, and then these red craws, again, I wait that for a little bit longer on that guy. So that's sort of the breakdown of like mindset of color and all the stuff that's going on right here. Let's jump over here to Smith Mountain and sort of talk about where I'm going to be using these crankbaits. Now, of course, I know it's got a lot of docks on it and stuff. I've seen it, obviously watching video and whatnot. But really where I'm going to focus my cranking efforts is going to be more so in some of these major creeks, because you're going to have a little bit more flow in these creeks, these areas right here, in the backs of these places right here. I'm going to get back here and get on these channel swings. I don't know if there's a drawdown on Smith Mountain, but if there is a drawdown, typically that really focuses those fish on those outside swings, and typically it gets them where they want a little bit more depth of water, right? So these outside swings, like you can see that tree channel sort of bumps up right in here. That's going to be a place that I'm going to look at. Maybe not way back in the creek, but I'm definitely going to be on the back third. Is going to be a major area that I'll focus on where those swings are happening, and it could be like little bluffy banks, little rocky banks, could be riprap. That's really the key, is like I'm focused on riprap and what I'm going to be using there. Really, I'm looking for some stained water. The only time I'll be cranking if the water's clean on a body of water. Typically I'll be 3-0ing something more natural, like that natural crawl or that phantom brown crawl, but I'll be looking for like the same sort of scenario, more so like gravel banks, some of those flatter banks, out here more towards the main, like little bump out points like this guy right here, or little flats inside there. You can sort of see how that swings in there right there. Like I'll crank that kind of stuff with wind. So wind, you can catch them cranking, but if it's flat calm, you're just asking for it. Like I'm not saying you can't catch them on a crankbait in clear water with zero wind, but for me, that's not my first choice, okay? So just wind is your friend, clear water crankbaits, especially in clean water. Now, if the water's dirty, you have no wind, no problem, because you have that, it's going to conceal that crankbait. They're not going to see it as well, and they're going to react a little bit differently. So a little bit different scenario, but that's sort of the breakdown on the crankbait side of things. That's what I would focus on, and a little bit of my mindset of how I'm going to be doing it. So let's move these guys over here. Next on the list, I'm going to really quickly you guys know I'm going to have a jig tied on, similar to the last episode in November. I cut down the pinchers on this cleanup crawl back here. 1/2 ounce is typically my favorite. 17-pound line, it's just so versatile. I still probably won't be throwing a jig that much in December, really focused on more so that, again, the bait fish sort of profiles. But a jig, if I'm in the back of the boat with somebody, or you know, I'm just sort of messing around and like, hey, I want to pitch bluffs and catch them doing that, which is fun, I'll pick up a jig and have it always tied on the deck, right? I always have one tied up, 1/2 ounce, cleanup crawl, cast it out there on a point and drag it around, flip like a piece of wood, whatever. You just have it ready to roll. You know what I'm saying? Brush piles, another good thing for a jig in the wintertime. So that's why I would definitely have that rigged up, ready to roll. Wintertime baits. Last episode we talked about a basically like a silver buddy type lure, like, you know, your blade baits. This guy right here, the ripping blade, he's the Rapala version of a blade bait. Really good bait. But then also going hand in hand is tail spinners. This one's the Derrick Coop from Jackal. A little bit different scenario. Personally, for me, I've gone back and forth on a tail spinner. So a tail spinner, the cool thing about a tail spinner is this is like a full 1 ounce, right? So I can get them down there super deep, smaller profile, not a lot of weight or not a lot of resistance, but it gets down there. And I'm using them very similar, okay? So this bait, you know, like a blade bait, I'm drop, 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 sort of something like that. You're trying to keep your small hops, right? Blade bait, I do the same thing. I might go drop, drop. So he's going, that tail is just, you know, rotating back there. And a lot of times they fight it on the fall. So different. The only thing that I will say that personally for me, I've caught a lot of fish on this bait, but I've lost a lot of fish on this bait and missed a lot of fish on this bait because why? Of course, only has one hook up there. So I've upsized that hook at times, but again, when you upsize your hook, you're typically going to get hung up more. So I think it's a bait that I still will throw and something that I think that catches them in certain scenarios because I cannot throw this bait out there in 30 feet of water if the fish are deeper, as well as I can get down to the bottom with a 1 ounce Derrick Coop, right? But if I can get them down there, I'm probably going to catch more on this bait or catch more fish when they do bite it than on this. So it's a little bit different, but it is a bait that like, if you guys actually let me know this because I'm not like the master on tail spinners. If you're a big tail spin fisherman, I know like Little Georges and stuff like that, those are a little bit lighter. I think the 1 ounce is the biggest reason, like probably why I miss them more. Then, of course, the 1/2 ounce I've not had as many issues because you have a smaller piece of lead or metal, and then you do have a smaller hook, but they can eat it. But then at that point in time, I'm like, all right, you know, for me, I have a lot of confidence in a blade bait in the wintertime, so it's like hard to figure out which one I'm going to choose, you know. But that's just, you know, for all my tail spinner fishermen out there, I know there's a lot of different ones, Little Georges and several others. Let me know sort of your thoughts on that. If you have an opinion of it, let me sort of know because I'm always open ears and understanding a little bit and learning because I've caught a lot of fish on it, but I sort of go back and forth. I always have it in the boat in the wintertime, but I always have one on the rod. But it's one of those things like I'm like, is there something better? So let's sort of jump into where I'm going to be throwing both those baits. A lot of times, sort of similar to like a freeloader, a lot of the fish that I'm going to be focusing throwing this stuff is going to either be on transitions. Let me sort of pop out of this creek, more main lake driven. So either I'm going to focus a lot of this either on like the points, on the tips of the points, on hard bottom points, you know, probably 15 to 25 feet of water, or I'm going to be focusing my energy throwing both these baits more in the backs of those cuts, right? Fishing like where that water comes up, where the fish are pushing the bait in, anywhere that there's a lot of bait fish around, or even like in scenarios like bluff ends. Okay, let's see if we can find a bluff end scenario. So you hear bluff end a lot of times in tournament bass fishing. Typically a bluff end, probably like right here would be the best representation. I don't know if this would be a bluff necessarily, but it's typical. This is more like a typical bluff end. Okay, so you have a really hard channel swing right here, okay? Really hard. You can see how steep that bank is right there, sort of. Basically, you see how this sort of like that bank gets a little flatter right here and you have that shallower push right there. That would be more of a typical bluff end. Not exactly, but that would be like more of a bluff end for what I'm looking at Smith Mountain. I don't know if there's a ton of those, but that's sort of like what I'm talking about when I'm talking about bluff ends, because you have this deep water transition, then you have a shallow point, right? and that's where those fish can congregate. When they're not on that steeper stuff, they sort of slide up on the ends of those bluffs or ends of that channel swing to sort of feed. So that's sort of like where I'm looking for when I'm throwing some of the stuff through. And it's a good thing to throw cranking and whatnot as well. So let me know, drop a comment below. Also, if you guys would do me a favor, drop a comment below as far as maybe what lake you're trying to sort of hear about. Like what, maybe there's a new lake that I need to look at and just sort of just dive into, like comment, like my friend, you know, commented right there, like it's like, hey, Smith Mountain. I'm like, you know what? Why not? Let's check out Smith Mountain. So we got a couple different things here. Let's sort of dive into. I have a couple more on the front on the table right now. One thing that I definitely want to sort of hit on is spinnerbait. Spinnerbaits are very underrated right now. I feel like they're the sleeper in tournament bass fishing and bass fishing in general. They've been sort of forgotten about in a lot of ways. Obviously, a chatterbait's probably the #1 in my mind. But a spinnerbait is probably one of the better baits to throw this time of year when your water temperatures are the mid-50s to like low 50s, high 50s to low 50s, because it slows that vibration in the blade, slow that bait down. A chatterbait comes through the water column pretty fast, where a spinnerbait, I can swim through some trees. He's really, truly like I'm not gonna say weedless completely, but he's really good around wood. Works really well in a lot of that scenario. So 3/4 ounce for me is my favorite. I change the color, of course, depending on the water clarity. You know, backs of the creek, same sort of scenario. If I'm cranking down a bank in the backs of some creeks and the water's pretty dirty back there, and I come to some more laydowns, a lot of times I'll throw a crankbait by them. But if it's really one of those gnarly laydowns and the water fish, I feel like the fish are up further, that's when I'll pick up a spinnerbait and wind that spinnerbait sort of by a lot of this, you know, slow wind. Not to mention a lot of current. This time of year, a lot of the fish are on the dams and other places. Current seems a 3/4 ounce spinnerbait gets it done. This one right here is that accent. I put a freeloader on the back of it. But I just sort of, I like a trailer on the back of my spinnerbait just because I feel like it gives them something to hold on to. I've always been a fan of that. I don't throw a lot of trailer hooks on the back of my spinnerbaits and my buzz baits because I typically run, of course, that trailer right there. Either that trailer or a swim bait, something like that. So some sort of plastic back there to sort of give them something there. That's an accent, I guess that's 3/4. That's the current special, but I've caught them on it just fishing down the bank and stuff. So changing up the water, changing up the color depending on where you're really at and what the water clarity is going to be important on a spinnerbait, but definitely when you're wanting to throw. So sort of touch on this, like I just sort of said, backs of the creeks, same sort of scenario, backs of those creeks, like right in here, this whole area back in there, you know, some of that wood, water clarity be staying in that scenario. If the water clarity is cleaner and I want to get out the mouths of the creeks, I might throw more of that, you know, translucent colors more so, and I need a little bit of wind in that scenario too. Spinnerbait's a great bait when the wind's blowing. It's sort of like a mini Alabama rig. I did not put an Alabama rig in this lineup, but an Alabama rig is great this time of year. So I didn't bring it in, but it's definitely one that I have on the deck as well when I'm fishing out there in the month of December. Last but not least, you guys know you got to have it. It is what it is. It's a staple in the box. Every fisherman when it gets cold, and that's a jerkbait. There's a lot of different jerkbaits out there on the market. One I've thrown a lot this season is the Maverick. This is the shallower lip Maverick. They have a deeper lip Maverick. I really like the shallow lip one. I think that it gets bit, has good action, has good colors. The thing that I will say with a jerkbait collectively, and bass in general, when the water gets colder, they get dumber. Okay, I'm not gonna say they get like they're not smart at all or they don't understand what's going on, but they just are slower processing information. You can see them, like that's one thing we've learned with live is you're able to see them, like they get up there and they look and they sort of look at it and they're like, yeah, okay, I'll buy it, right? Where in the summertime that doesn't happen. They make their decision pretty quickly and they look at it and they say, nah, I'm out of here. So working your bait slowly, sort of hence why I put a suspend dots on there and stuff like that, can make a difference in generating the bite. Doesn't mean you always have to do that. It just means that that can, in certain times, be the way to generate more bites. So a suspending jerkbait, one that has good hooks in it. This is the best jerkbait with hooks out of the package, hands down on the market. In my opinion, has super sticky hooks, like the best hooks you could possibly put on a jerkbait. Size number 5 red line VMCs. They are insanely sharp, and like if anything even touches it, and that means you as well in your gloves, because trust me, I've done it. Like you got your wool gloves, and you're like, yeah, I'm good to go, and you got all that jerkbait, all these small hooks in your hand. Yeah, that's the only thing I will say. Be careful with the gloves. But as far as jerkbaits go, you can't go wrong. You guys have seen thousands of videos probably, or hundreds of videos of me throwing a jerkbait. This bait right here is a really good one. Shallower, 4 to 6 foot diver. I like to fish like, if I'm fishing shallower with a, a shallow running jerkbait, I really like to focus on a lot of these places, like these little secondary points. Let's just mainly point right here, this little place. Again, deep water or steeper bank to like shallower bank is like what I'm looking for in the winter time. So deeper bank to shallower little point, shallower little flat. That's sort of what I'm looking for. Or if this whole flat right here has a lot of timber on it, like it shows it has, I'm sure it probably doesn't have that much timber, but maybe it does. Then I'll probably spend my time really like maybe jerking down this whole flat, especially if there's any wind blowing on it. So you could also go in the backs of the pockets and jerk around in the backs of the pockets, because again, the fish already go in the backs of the pockets. You hear this term like the shad moves the backs of the creeks this time of year. I don't know if that's necessarily always true, but they definitely tend to slide backs in the backs of pockets and coves and cuts. I'm not going to say the creeks in general. It doesn't have to be a major creek. I think there's just always an abundance of shad in the backs of the creeks, period, right? Just sort of how it is. But that's something that like I do think that maybe they meant that. Like when whoever come up with that whole thing, like the shad move the backs of the creeks, they move the backs of the pockets. And pockets are a little bit different than creeks. Creeks in my mind is just the actual main creeks that run into the lake. So like a lot of creeks don't have, you might have 4 or 5 creeks that run into your whole lake. Where you have pockets and cuts, and those aren't, they don't have a lot of flow, but the shad do tend to sort of shift back in those places. So not completely wrong, but I would say more winter time they move back in those. All right, so yeah. So anyway, long story short, just sort of thinking through that, I'm like, that's sort of interesting, but it's not wrong, but it's not necessarily right. Okay, so where am I going to be throwing that jerk bait? Of course, in the backs of those pockets, the points, all that stuff. I am going to take my time and go bop, bop. My cadence is typically when I start out, throw it out there, reel it down. That's a big thing I think a lot of people mess up on. When you're throwing a jerk bait, they don't reel your jerk bait down. So reel it down to get down to desired depth. So like if you just go throwing this jerk bait out there, cast it out there, you jerk, 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 he's only going to get down like 2 to 3 feet. But if you cast him out there and you reel him down about 4 or 5 cranks, he's going to be down at 3 feet already, and then you're throwing that jerk bait and he's getting down there 4, 5, 6 feet deep. He's diving deeper as your sort of retrieve goes on. And then as you get to like 30 feet out, he starts to come up because you only have so much line. So that's something to learn no matter what jerkbait you're throwing. Make sure you reel your jerkbait down if you're trying to get to the desired depth or a little bit more depth out of your jerkbait. Of course, if you're you're fishing on grass lines, stuff like that, you might want to start jerking it right off the top. You might only get 3 feet deep and you're ready to roll. So colors go, simple, easy. Don't get too crazy with this. Of course, traditional colors like your shad profiles and stuff like that are always good to go. You can't go wrong with a Pro Blue. But I don't get too crazy with colors with the jerkbait. I probably have 4 or 5 different ones. There are a couple that I'm like, all right, I think they matter sometimes, but translucent colors on sunny days, solid colors on cloudy days, and then like flashy colors when the wind blows a lot of times, and then your water's like a little bit like maybe not super stained, but a little bit clean, but not, like sort of in between. That's sort of my traditional setup for how I'm sort of going about it. So that is the rundown for the top baits of the month. Hopefully you guys got a lot of information out of here. We'll drop a couple links below in the description below. Try to tag those MOOCH minnows. Also, I'll try to tag the sales that are happening on the rods. We've had a phenomenal off season so far. This season, craziness, been a lot of fun. We have the Australia videos coming up here very soon in the month of December, so those will be, I'm looking forward to you guys seeing that one, because it'll be, that was like one of the most fun trips I've ever had. And we will be back at you here very soon. We'll check with you guys later. See ya.